Hi, my name is Dale LaPlante. I've been designing board games for about 3 years. Um, and I wanted to go over just some of my experiences with designing and playtesting my latest game. Go over some of the lessons I've learned about, the game itself, but also what players want. And hopefully this is helpful for people who are interested in the topic or designing their own game or, yeah, just interested seeing how games develop. Um, there's a whole lot of videos on YouTube that go in depth about how to start the design process yourself and, good tips on that and all of that stuff. This is going to be more of a case study of this game as it goes through development and the lessons I learned. So let's get into it. For this first video, I actually have a lot of catch up to do because I've been designing this game for at least 6 months, probably more. I don't know how long. Game design takes a very long time. It can be endless. You eventually have to cut it off somewhere, but yeah, you're really in it for the long haul when designing a game. There's a cute cat outside. Nice. Yeah, so I have some catch up to do here because this game's been in development for a while. So for this first video, I'm just going to go through all of the lessons I've learned developing this game so far, and you can see kind of how it's changed through that development. So to start off, we have some kind of guiding principles. You'll see these a lot in a lot of intro videos and just in the community around game design in general. So we're mainly going to be looking at finding interesting decisions for players to make throughout the game. When playtesting and when testing and analyzing how your game is going, the guiding principle is going to be find the fun. That means we're looking for things that are fun. Should be obvious, but things that are fun. This will, a lot of things could sound good in theory, and you could be super interested in a lot of mechanics, but what's most important at the end of the day is whether or not the game is fun. And so you don't really know what parts of your game are fun until you actually playtest it and find out. So what you're going to do is playtest it, see what players are enjoying, keep those parts and really hone in on them, and ditch everything else. And on that note, last principle is kill your darlings. That means really don't get too attached to anything, because you're going to have to scrap a lot of ideas, a lot of mechanics. You're going to have to rework things over and over and over. That's just the nature of the beast. This game is, in fact, as you'll see, it's completely different nowadays compared to when I first started it. And you'll see why. So when I started this game, I wanted it to make, for those of you who know the game Armello, it's a computer game, also recently a board game that had a successful Kickstarter. And it's an amazing game where you're each kind of this woodland creature who's an adventurer and wanders around a hex grid map, fighting other players and, questing. Though the quests in that game are really just walking across the map. But I really love it, so I wanted to kind of make my own spin on it. So I started with a hex grid here, and as you can see, there's lots of little places you can go and things you can do. In the game, you have stats such as strength, magic, strength, diplomacy, etc. And so originally you could go around the map, and if you go here to the hermit, you could heal. If you go here to the guild hall, you could upgrade using money. The dungeon lets you get money. There's various other ways to get money, so on. And if you cross paths with another player, you would have a fight. So the game had NPCs that would give you quests. So these quests could be things like going and fighting another NPC, or maybe gathering certain relics that you can find around the map. They would give you upgrades or gold that you could spend on upgrades, as well as victory points. These were the NPCs themselves. They had, they could fight you if you came too close to them. They had diplomacy stats of their own, and back in this version, diplomacy would let you kind of redirect cards. So they had the ability, you could go up and fight an NPC to, you know, make to kill them, and anyone who had a quest from them would fail the quest automatically. NPCs had their own turns where they would do things, as well as have special abilities for during fights. And yeah, you would gather cards that would let you, move around the map. This was an early mechanic I had called Plan that would let you draw essentially more cards in a weird way. There would be ways to put traps all around the map, and fighting mainly was through these attack cards, or you could use any card in your hand as just a basic one. And so what would happen in this game is that I expected players to walk around, collect quests, collect gold, but also fight each other along the way and maybe compete over quests and things like that. However, there was a few issues with this. One is that you needed cards in your hand in order to fight each other. So players would sometimes be in this kind of paralyzed state where they wouldn't want to spend their cards, moving around or getting quests or other things because they were worried about getting into a fight. And so instead what they would do is they would just maybe move a little bit, but otherwise sit around and wait to see what happens and wait for an opening, and ended up actually not really playing the game. Instead, yeah, they were just kind of paralyzed and waiting. And that was, I guess, a fault of the design around the resources for fighting, because the resources you needed for a fight were the same things you needed for kind of doing anything else. So what this ended up doing was this kind of incentivized players not to do anything for fear that they might get into a fight, or they would drastically avoid fights because, if they spent cards in their hand to do anything else, they didn't want to get into it. So the lesson I learned from that was don't incentivize non-play. So non-play in this case is, as I said, holding on to your cards for fear of something else, or not wanting to engage with mechanics of the game for fear of one thing or for waiting around for another or something like that. The other lesson that I learned pretty quickly from that, as I said, was players, So first thing I did was fix that. So now I introduced a currency called effort. So every player had a certain amount of this, you could get more, and there were certain cards that could help you reduce effort or gain it back. But for the most part, you had a replenishing supply, and you could use effort in a fight. Now, players' hands were freed up to use for other things, like quests or activating tiles or getting relics, whatever. So that helped. I thought, okay, now players are incentivized, are no longer blocking themselves from fighting. They have plenty of resources, plenty to spare. What could go wrong? So pretty quickly into, the next few playtests of this, I saw that even with that, they were using all their cards now, but they were actively moving quite far away from each other. And they were actively avoiding fighting at all costs, even if they had good cards for it. What I learned with that is that players will avoid conflict. That seems very true. They'll avoid conflict even if they have the upper hand usually, or at least in my experience, unless there's a very clear and sometimes unavoidable incentive, such as a zero-sum game, like if they can't get past a certain part of the map without conflict. That's actually what I thought I could do with this, where I made these corridors through mountains where you couldn't cross them unless you went through that corridor. But unfortunately, players just went somewhere else. They abandoned even a quest they were on the way to do just to avoid conflict. They ended up also moving around the map quite far to get to where they needed to go. This map is decently sized, and even with some good speed cards, I would often see players spending half their turn or more just moving across the map to do one thing and then moving across the map to do something else. I learned from that this movement, while it to me felt like, oh, you could optimize to make sure you're doing multiple things in one area, and it felt cool, like an adventure, like you're moving across this realm. Unfortunately, most players just saw it as an inconvenience and kind of something that they had to do before they got to the fun. So what I learned from that is skip to the good part. Just go immediately to whatever is fun in the game. If players really want to, collect relics, they should be able to get to them fairly quickly. If not, there should be a good reason for it, besides just there should be a cost, What else? So, in this version, there were a lot of, as I said, I introduced effort to fix the fighting, but I also wanted players to start trading. I wanted this to be cooperative, semi-competitive, where you have to fight each other, you have to trade with each other, do what you need to get ahead. So I introduced a couple more resources on top of it. So for those keeping track, at the start, I had gold, and I had relics, and I had cards. Now I had gold, relics, cards, effort, as well as these things called favor, which you could trade freely. In fact, favor is useless and worthless to you. It's not worth anything, but it's worth something to other people. They could trade it in for gold or some other stuff. So I thought, great. Now players have a resource that they can freely trade at no cost to get some benefit from other people. I had diplomacy cards that would encourage you to do it automatically, but players were also able to, if they could just get close to each other, trade. Unfortunately, this was a problem because players seemed, even when they had all of these free resources to trade away, there was some incentive, I still don't know exactly what, where players just didn't really want to trade or didn't feel like it benefited them that much, or maybe they were afraid that it would benefit their opponents even more. So I learned players won't trade unless necessary. I think these two are interesting together because it seems to imply that players are avoiding interaction, which is interesting because for me and many other players, player interaction is one of the most fun parts of any game. So I was really confused because I thought I was making this game where players were adventuring across the land and, interacting with each other along the way to hinder each other, to try to get help from each other. But really what was happening was players would usually just wander to the nearest dungeon to get coins, and then avoid players to get to the next dungeon, and avoid players to maybe go to an NPC where they could get a quest, and avoid players. And I didn't know what was going on. It was pretty confusing. And at first I thought, well, maybe it's because of this, skip to the good part. Maybe it's because in order to interact with each other, they have to go out of their way and avoid the things that seem intuitively good, like money. So, at this point, I realized this map has to go. First of all, there's a lot of information on this map, and given the amount of information, the amount of resources, the amount of decisions, I was creating a lot of interesting decisions, but in a way too many. And when you overwhelm players, obviously they get choice paralysis, but a lot of them also just become apathetic. They think, there's so much here, I might as well just try something and see if that works. And a lot of that something that players try is whatever seems the safest and the most intuitive. So just going to a square on the map that says get money was, for almost every single player, the default option and what they would just do over and over. So I said, okay, screw this map. This isn't working. I got rid of it. I wanted to speed it up a bit, make it easier to get to each other, reduce the number of options available, and also push players into each other to force some conflict. I made this map. It does use AI for the art, but like a lot of other designers, I use AI art for the design process because, as you can see, you go through these things nonstop. I'm actually working on releasing a game right now, and I've hired an artist to do the art for that, which I'm very happy about. But yeah, you'll see AI art in a lot of designers' games just because it helps us get a feel for the game without having to pay hundreds of dollars for something we're just going to throw away anyway. So yeah. So in this map, there's, different effects on here. There's 5 different kind of types of tiles, as opposed to the previous one, which had about 15-20 types. So here the options are much more limited and much easier to get your head around them. There's much less space, so you kind of can't avoid conflict, or at least player interaction. And it's also much easier to move around. Now you can move anywhere on the map with just a single movement. So now you can get what you want, you can get player interaction, everything's super easy. Yeah, let me just see some of the stuff I have here. Yeah, there's a lot of different mechanics here. I won't go into it because I've run through them, and as I said, it's good to just try out mechanics. Like here, I kind of had like a prisoner's dilemma every single round in order for people to get money, but that ended up feeling kind of like a side game to the main game, so I got rid of it. Here, I updated NPCs to be color-coded, and I stuck with that for a while. I made it so relics could give you like these super good permanent upgrades. And in this map, you'll see I still have, these are relics. They're still relics, and they still can give you these permanent upgrades. There's still NPCs running around. But for some reason, this still didn't solve what I was looking for. I still had, quests, and I updated the upgrades a bit, but players still actively avoided each other. And even still, they still didn't really optimize around all of these buildings I had, and I wasn't sure why. I think players were still looking for kind of a default path, a simple path, or an intuitive path of some kind, and I think what I offered them was a little too open. It was a little too open world where they had to create their own path to victory, their own strategy, rather than it being too obvious. Let me just read here. One problem was that there was a lot of ways to optimize around your resources. There were relics you could get for special things. There were, gold you could get to buy more upgrades. There were bonuses to your stats you could get for fights. There were, favors and effort and all of this stuff. And a couple notes I got were that it was too many resources for players. I thought that by giving players all these resources, they could come up with a lot of interesting strategies. There would be a lot of interesting decisions. But what I found was that I was just overwhelming them. It wasn't fun dealing with all the different resources. So what was fun? What did work from all this? One thing that worked was the fights. When players did eventually get into a fight, they had a lot of fun. So I wanted to focus more on that. What I also found players really liked, 2 to 3 resources max. I learned that there were too many resources in my game, and I have cut it down since then. What I also found for what's fun is that players, as I mentioned kind of earlier, players would go after gold. They would go after gold wherever they could find it. And players really love getting and spending money. They really love that. There's something to do with our monkey brains that says, give me shiny coins that I can spend on nourishment, on upgrades, on resources. Yeah. This is what I've learned so far. So I'm trying to push players. Sorry. I'm trying to push players more into interacting with each other, because both that was kind of what I thought would be fun in the game, or one of the things, and what I actually did discover was fun. When players got into the fights, they enjoyed them. So I want to push players into that. I want to make getting the gold and getting resources to spend a kind of critical path in the game, since players already assume it is. And something else that is a little tangential now, but whatever. This was an update I made to the cards, and that's because on the top here is like kind of a basic action that you can make with any card by discarding it from your hand, and on the bottom is a special effect for this card. So at this point in the game, each card had a basic action and a special effect action. And when I made these cards, I wanted them to be very powerful. I wanted to speed up the game. So I thought, okay, every single card now will give you both a basic action and a special action, every single one. So now you don't have to, waste so many cards on basic actions that you would otherwise spend for interesting effects. However, when I did that, and when players looked at these cards, they intuitively thought, here's one action, here's another, I can only choose one of these. And it was interesting because that directly went against what, I had in the helper sheet. I had one over in the rules. This was, to me, very unintuitive because it didn't make sense. Why would you be limited to one specific basic action with this card when the rules at the time said you could discard this card for any basic action? But that's what players thought. They saw two things with a box around them and thought, I can only choose one of these. And I noticed that for a few other mechanics in my game where, unless I both explained it but also re-explained it, there were certain things that they kind of just assumed how they worked. And in some cases, this was my fault for, there was just too much complexity in certain parts of the game. But at other times, this was just the players not knowing yet about a certain thing and guessing. And it was interesting to me that players would guess, rather than, ask me or look it up in the rules or something. But that's something I learned in this, which is players will fill in the gaps. If the players don't know something or how to do something, they will try to guess how to do it, or at least in some cases will. They'll look at something on the map and guess what it means rather than looking it up. I guess because it's easier, it's quicker, it's more intuitive. So, with all of these lessons, I've now moved on to a bigger and better version of the game. I actually very heavily scrapped a lot of what I had in order to, push, as I said, players into doing that thing that I knew was fun for them in order to encourage them to get and spend resources while keeping those resources low, while trying to make everything as intuitive as possible, and while making it never optimal, or in many ways not even an option, to not play. I'm going to go over that in my next video. I hope this was helpful. I hope this was interesting or fun. I hope we find the fun in this series somehow. So I'll see you next time.